Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a weekly podcast bringing readers and writers of Australian fiction together. I'm Claudine Tinellis. As an avid reader and passionate advocate for Australian fiction, I make it my mission to spotlight local talent. So if you're looking for your next read or simply want to learn more about the Australian literary scene, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and relax. Dervla McTiernan is an international best-selling, critically acclaimed author of 4 novels along with 3 Audible titles. After emigrating to Australia from Ireland in 2011, Dervla decided to turn her hand to novel writing. Her debut novel, The Ruin, was the result. Published in 2018, The Ruin was the first novel in Dervla's Detective Cormac Reilly series. That novel went on to become a top 10 bestseller and the Amazon Best Book of July 2018. It also won the Ned Kelly Award for Best Debut Crime Novel, along with a David Award and a Barry Award. Her second book, The Scholar, published the year after, also became a top 5 bestseller, and the third book in that series, The Good Turn, followed in 2020. It was at an event to celebrate the launch of The Good Turn in early 2020 that I had the pleasure of meeting Dervla for the first time. Little did we know then that a nationwide lockdown was just around the corner. But I do have a distinct recollection of someone at that event asking if Dervla was planning the next Cormac Reilly novel, and to our collective surprise, the answer was no. Our beloved Cormac was taking a break from his crime-busting activities, and now, 2 years later, we know why. The Murder Rule is Dervla's brand new book, only just published by HarperCollins Australia. It's a standalone. And listeners, this is one incredibly gripping, fascinating, hair-raising and compelling read. I read it in practically one sitting and I loved it. And so it is with excitement and much awe that I humbly welcome Dervla to the podcast today. Hi, Dervla.
Hi, Claudine. Oh my God, what an introduction. I'm going to just lie on the floor now in sheer embarrassment.
No, I did tell you it was long-winded, but as I also said, there was so much to talk about. But I also wanted to offer my congratulations on the publication of The Murder Rule. I'm so delighted to have this opportunity to chat with you about this incredible new book.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I'm so excited that it's out in the world and that I'm out in the world, not on lockdown, seeing real humans. It's been very exciting.
It is, absolutely. Now, apart from one novella and this book, all your books have been set in Ireland, haven't they?
They have.
Yeah.
It's a bit of a departure for me.
It is, yeah. So I'm intrigued to learn why this one isn't. And given travel restrictions of the past couple of years, whether it made writing The Murder Rule more difficult.
Well, it definitely made it more difficult because I did intend to go back again. The book, so The Murder Rule follows, I suppose there's a lot in that question. I mean, in terms of why this one was set in America, it was because the story revolves around the Innocence Project. So given that and given the kind of law I wanted to deal with, it was always going to be an American story. I decided to set it partially in Maine and partially in Virginia. Maine, because I lived and worked there for 5 months when I was a law student myself, many years ago now. And I had some very strong memories of Maine that I really always wanted to bring to a story. And Virginia, for 2 reasons, partially because the law worked. I needed very specific kind of setup. And partially because I thought it looked beautiful and I was curious. I wanted to visit it. And I have a friend who sets all of her books in amazing cities so she can do research trips there. And I thought, brilliant idea. I'm totally going to steal that.
I was going to say it's funny that I only learned about the Innocence Project recently. So what was it specifically that inspired you to write this novel?
Well, it started with an article I read many years ago about a young Irish law student who went to the US on her J1 visa. And J1s are very they're a tradition in Ireland. Like you get this visa when you're a college student, you get to go and work and live there for the summer. And most of us do it. And to be honest with you, most of us go and we have a lot of fun. I mean, I went to Maine. I worked as a chambermaid in this upmarket B&B. And I also worked as a waitress and I lived with my best buddy and we had a blast. We had an absolute blast. But Niamh didn't just go and have fun. She went and this law student, she went and volunteered for the Innocence Project. And when she came back to Ireland, she couldn't let go of the case. So she kept working it. She kept making phone calls and she managed to track down this retired police officer who pointed her to some evidence that had been hidden in the original case. And so because of Niamh's work, this man who had spent more than 20 years in prison was released. And I came across this story in various articles that were printed in the Irish newspapers. And I just thought, my God, like this is so inspiring, first of all, on every level. And secondly, wow, it puts me to shame. You know, I was partying in Maine and this young woman was changing like everything for this person. But I didn't really feel like there was a story there for me to tell, because I kind of felt, well, that story's complete in and of itself. But it was a couple of years later, and I still don't know why I came across it again, whether it was nagging at the back of my mind and I went and started researching it, or if I stumbled across it again, it just prompted me to start thinking about it. But either way, I did a bit more digging, and it turned out that after this young woman found this evidence, it took another 5 years for the case to be heard, just because of the usual bureaucracy. And by the time he was released, he'd been in prison 26 years, and he only had 3 years left to run on his original sentence. And I just thought, oh my God, like it's so tragic, and it's so sad, and it's so much more complex than the original story that was told. And I couldn't help but think, why was the cleaner story the one we all read about initially? Like, why was it this more inspirational take, but less accurate take? And I thought, well, maybe the editors of the various papers thought this was the more interesting story to tell, or maybe the Innocence Project, this was entirely coming from my head, by the way, guys, I have no reason to think this, but maybe the Innocence Project had this sophisticated PR team, and they were sending out this more inspirational tale into the world because they knew it would get more traction. Then I thought, okay, if that had been the case, if that had actually happened, would I blame them for it? And the answer was no, because they're trying to do something really important in a world that is so loud and so noisy that just doesn't care. And I thought, if I was in that situation and the only way I could be effective was to take one small step off the strictly moral path, would I take it? I think I would, if things were important enough. And then would I take another step, and then another step? And then where would that lead me? And once I started thinking along those lines, I kind of thought, oh, I think I've got a story to tell here.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating. Okay, Dervla, so for those who haven't read The Murder Rule yet, can you tell us a little bit more about the story?
Well, the story follows a young woman called Hannah Rokeby. And Hannah is this young, idealistic law student. She joins the Innocence Project on the eve of their biggest case at the University of Virginia. They're trying to save an innocent man from death row. And at first glance, Hannah's exactly what you'd expect her to be. She's young, eager, very clever, but also kind of keen to please and trying to fit in, and she wants to change the world. And she's not like that at all, actually. Once you scrape the surface, what you find is a Hannah who's a lot darker, a lot more complicated, and she's definitely working to her own agenda.
Hannah was, I felt, such a nuanced but also an incredible character. She was determined. She was gutsy. She was resourceful. She was a woman that any wrongly accused person would be lucky to have on side. She really was. Now, hearing your inspiration for the story, I wondered if perhaps she was based on a real life person.
No, but she's definitely a degree of wish fulfillment for me, which is bizarre. And when people read the book, they're going to go, really? Really? But I was a lawyer, like I qualified as a lawyer, I think when I was 22. And even before that, I was working in practice, because that's part of how you train to be a lawyer in Ireland. And, in those days, like it was, as a young 22-year-old woman going into a meeting, it would be all men around the table, because you're usually meeting with the leadership team of whatever company you're working with. And they were all men, and they were 20, 30 years older than me. And there was just a way that young women were expected to behave, like it was okay to be good at your job, but you just couldn't be like obvious about it, and you had to be pleasant and smiley and just agreeable in a way that I don't think is required anymore, or is less required. And I think I've spent a large part of my brain power was taken up with considering, did I do that right? How did they react to that? Should I have taken another approach? How was that received? I saw myself through other people's eyes, always. And I was quite diffident. And I see young women today are not like that. And I love it. I love to see how powerful they are. And, with Hannah, I really wanted to write a character who, she is super confident. She knows what she's good at. She's got this deep confidence in her own abilities. And it's not arrogance. It's just self-knowledge. Where Hannah goes wrong is that she combines that confidence with a degree of sort of belief that she is right and that she is on the right side. And I think when you combine the two things, this total belief in your own point of view to the degree that you can't see anything else, and combine that with sort of this confidence, that results in someone who's willing to take some pretty extreme actions. So the Hannah we meet at the beginning of the book, like, she's not always pleasant, I'm not sure that you would trust her easily, but she's certainly effective. And so for that reason, I wanted to write a young woman who was unconstrained by the things I had personally felt constrained by when I was younger.
As an ex-practicing lawyer myself, I don't know that I would have taken the kinds of risks that Hannah took. I was much more like you, always worried, second guessing myself, and always worried what other people would think. And I didn't want to overstep the mark, and, but very much knew my place. Well, I thought I knew my place. Yeah.
Claudine, that's exactly it. And it's amazing how common that experience is. I was speaking on a podcast with two American lawyers obviously in the US, and they're both still practicing, one to a lesser degree than the other. And I was saying, this was my experience 20 years ago when I was a lawyer. And they were like, no, well, it still happens today. One of them had worked in a big finance role, and she was saying it was more that she adapted to become more masculine to fit that environment. The other one was saying her experience is very similar to mine, that women, to be effective, you must be pleasant first, and then you can be effective, because women are not rewarded for being less than pleasant. Does that make sense?
It completely does. Yeah, it is all about keeping the smile on your face, because otherwise, if you don't, and if you react in any other way, you're unprofessional or you're emotional. And I share the fascination with Hannah as a confident young woman, and I love seeing that also, as a mother to a teenage daughter. I love seeing those kind of characteristics in female protagonists. I absolutely loved her.
Thank you very much.
How much research did you have to do to bring Hannah and her story to the page?
Oh gosh, Claudine, the bloody research. The worst bit was the law, because what it's like reading primary sources, and you're reading legislation and reading criminal law, which I didn't practice, and American criminal law, which I'd never really encountered in any detail. As a commercial lawyer in Ireland, I was somewhat familiar with American contract law because we did so much trading with the US, but no criminal law. So trying to understand the criminal code in the US and the degree to which each state has different interpretations, and then the way federal law interacts with state law, all very new to me. And some of the nuances, it's just, you're reading the paragraph, what it's like, you're reading the paragraph for the 25th time, you're going, yeah, I'm pretty sure I've got it now. So that was hard, but I did sort of cheat, because I found some very interesting case law, and then I went and researched those specific cases and how they went through the courts, to sort of make sure that it could happen the way I was painting it. Like, it's not common, it's not every case, but it does happen, and has happened specifically in that way. And that was really helpful, because then, instead of trying to understand all of the primary sources and all of the legislation and all of the court rules, which is, quite esoteric, I was able to trace the pattern of various cases through the courts and mirror them to some degree. That made it a little bit easier.
Yeah, fantastic. It was so, so interesting. Now, Laura was Hannah's mother, and her backstory drives Hannah's actions in the contemporary thread. And suffice it to say that Hannah is not only interested in the Innocence Project for altruistic reasons, is she?
Mm-hmm. No, not at all. She's definitely up to no good.
I guess some of the big themes in this book, police corruption and mishandling or manufacturing of vital evidence, are strong features of this story. Now, I would like to say that our criminal justice system is robust enough to withstand such actions, but it often isn't. And wrongful convictions are being challenged all the time. So I wanted to ask you, Dervla, do you think that organisations like the Innocence Project have the effect of undermining public confidence in the justice system?
I think that they are necessary as part of the system of checks and balances. And I think in the absence of something like the Innocence Project, or ideally, other methods too, we will have massive miscarriage of justice, as we do have all the time. And I think that there are people who are directly impacted by those miscarriages of justice, and their families and their friends. Well, they have no confidence in the legal system. And particularly, I think in America, it seems that there are vast numbers of people who feel entirely left out and outside of it, and feel themselves to be constant targets, rather than protected by it. That is just the reality. And I think in the absence of people like the Innocence Project, we would have it so much worse, because they do an exceptional job. It's not just the high profile cases that they take where they shine a light on things that have gone wrong, but they're also looking to make systemic change, and they're lobbying to make systemic change. And that, I think, has the most impact in the long run. Because while we can talk about this high profile case or that high profile case, it's the systemic failures that go on unchecked, often just due to bureaucracy, negligence, human error, so on, or bias, that result in ongoing, continuing miscarriages of justice from the micro level right up to things like being convicted of murder and sent to death row. So I think they're just fundamental to any kind of fair system. And I'm so glad they're there. They may undermine confidence in the system. I think that's probably inevitable. But what we need to have next then is the bit that seems to be missing, which is the leadership that steps forward and goes, hang on, we have a problem here, let's fix it. That seems to be slower to come, you know.
Hannah was surprised by the number of people in jail who claimed to have been wrongly convicted. And that came out of like the kind of application process that people need to go through in order to be considered to be represented by the Innocence Project. Mm-hmm. Is this something that came out of your research as well?
Yes. I mean, one of the things that was fascinating from a research point of view was trying to understand how wrongful convictions happen, you know, trying to understand the psychology of the police who might be engaged in it, but also the evidence that goes before the courts that leads to so many wrongful convictions. So many people who are familiar with the Innocence Project would be aware of them because, you know, from a DNA point of view, when DNA evidence first became a thing, the Innocence Project rose to prominence because they could prove unequivocally that some people who were convicted and on death row, some people who had already been executed, were entirely innocent. But as things moved forward with DNA, and as the cases that moved through the courts and ended up in convictions were DNA cases, they had to look for other methods, or absent DNA cases, other methods to prove innocence. So one of the things they did was turn to junk science. So they were looking at examples where junk science had resulted in unjust convictions. And there were two things that struck me most powerfully. One was this thing to do with bite evidence. I mean, anybody who's watched an episode of CSI has seen bite evidence, you know, a picture of a bruise on a body. And then some, you know, specialists saying this is like a fingerprint, you know, this is absolutely James Bulger. He definitely did whatever. It's completely made up. Like, it's not based on the fact that a bruise is not the same as a fingerprint. And you cannot prove that it was this person or that person who delivered that. But many people were convicted on the basis of a very confident, you know, expert witness who went into court and was able to convincingly give this evidence. And then another area was arson, where fire investigators would come along and they'd investigate an arson situation. And they would say, because of this pattern of burn mark on the wall or on the floor, we can say without doubt that kerosene had to have been poured by somebody in this location. Therefore, it was arson. And therefore, if a death was caused by this arson, it was murder, and someone would be convicted. And again, it wasn't based on robust science. So while we can talk about the specific cases that came out of this, and we do, and they're horrendous, we need to look at the system failures that led to that. Like, specifically, why is it that junk science was able to be presented to court? How is it that our court systems have so little review of that, you know, the decision about whether or not someone goes to prison comes down to, is that a convincing witness? Can this person deliver this information in an interesting, convincing way to a jury or a judge? That shouldn't be what drives the decision. Surely it should be how strong the evidence is. But there didn't seem to be a method by which, you know, scientific evidence in particular had to be considered peer-reviewed, robust before it could be presented to the court. And, you know, groups like the Innocence Project, they lobby to try to improve our evidence standards in courts so that these sorts of mistakes don't happen.
Yeah, that was absolutely fascinating. Talking about the arson evidence, you know, Hannah came across one particular case that she, you know, she knew that there was, you know, subsequent scientific evidence in cases that had explored debunking that kind of evidence in court. I found that so fascinating. And I guess that leads me to talk a little about the title of your book. Hannah comes across this rule of law called the felony murder rule. Now, I'm no criminal lawyer. I certainly didn't practice criminal law when I was practicing. But it's my understanding there is a very similar kind of principle here in Australia, but I've not encountered any cases that deal with it.
So I understand, because there was an Australian prosecutor who was at my event the other night, and she was saying, yeah, we do have a version of that here, you know, and I actually have her email address, so I'm going to email her and get a bit more information about it. But I was very much researching it from a US point of view. And it's a weird bit of law. And for a lawyer, it's a weird bit of law, because I'm sure, like me, Claudine, like when I was briefly studied criminal law in law school, we were taught, to be criminally responsible, you must have mens rea and you must have actus rea. You must have actually committed the act yourself, and you must have intended to do so, which is why we differentiate between something like murder and manslaughter. If it's an accident, you can't convict somebody of murder, so on. But the felony murder rule says that if you commit a felony, and if in the course of the felony somebody dies, whether or not you've been directly involved in the death, you can be convicted of murder. So two of the weirder and more terrible examples of convictions that have resulted from that law were one where a man had committed an armed robbery and with an accomplice, and he was caught by the police, and he was arrested, and he was handcuffed, and he was put in the back of the police car. And he was still sitting in the back of the police car when the police officer shot his accomplice dead. So his body was killed, and he was convicted of felony murder. And there was a more egregious one where a man was at a party, a young man was at a party, and an acquaintance asked him if he could borrow his car. Now, the evidence about, the prosecution's evidence and defense's evidence kind of differs from here, but the prosecution said that he was told by the guy borrowing the car that he was going to a woman's house. He wanted to get his stuff back, the guy borrowing the car, and that he was probably he would break in if he had to get the stuff. And the guy said, take my car, fine, whatever. And he went home to bed. And he was convicted of felony murder because the guy who borrowed his car went to the house of this woman, broke in, she was there with a friend, there was a fight, and he killed somebody. And because the person who had lent the car knew that it was going to be used to facilitate a break-in, or at least the prosecution said he knew, he could be convicted of felony murder. And some of these cases, in some situations, people who are convicted of felony murder are sent away for longer than the guy who actually pulled the trigger. Like, not every state interprets the law that way. A few of them have some safeguards in place to protect people. They say, you must have actually had some direct involvement in the death yourself, that sort of stuff. But some of them don't. Yeah. And those are real cases,
Yeah, it is flabbergasting to hear of convictions under those circumstances. So tell me about how you came to call this book The Murder Rule. Was that your working title for the book, or was that the publisher's title?
It was definitely not my working title for the book. My working title for the book the whole way through was just Hannah Oakby, because I just liked the rhythm of the name, I think.
Indeed.
And when it came to coming up with the title, it was horrendous. It always is horrendous, because I'm super picky, and my agent is super picky, and my editor is picky, and it takes a long time. When I finally hit on The Murder Rule after about 1,000 terrible titles, I kind of knew this is it. And it wasn't just because, I can feed in that interesting case law to the story, but also because one of the things I was kind of interested in as I was writing was this question of culpability and responsibility. Like, when does responsibility begin and end? Like, we're responsible for everything that we can directly foresee from our actions. But are we responsible for the stuff that you couldn't possibly have foreseen would result? And then the gray area in between those two extremes, you should have foreseen that would happen if you had been careful and you had a duty to be careful. Where that sort of sliding scale lands for me with Hannah was one of the things I was thinking about. Like, to what degree is she responsible for the outcomes of her actions, and where should she have done better? And so it felt like a good title for the book for that reason.
Yeah, fantastic. Dervla, if there was one thing that you would like readers to take away from this novel, what would it be?
Oh, man. Claudine, it's always the same for me. Like, I always think about, we used to live in a house in Limerick, and I had a bedroom that I shared with my sister that was the perfect reading room, because the sunlight just kind of came in across the bed in the afternoon, and I would just disappear there and read for hours. And like a really good book, I would just be in it, like fully in it with the characters and in this world. And then I would wake up almost, I would finally finish it, or I'd have to go for dinner or something, and I would be almost blinking in the light, like, oh, I'm coming back into the real world. And I still love that feeling. It's like I'm a junkie, looking for the perfect book to get back to that. And when it happens, it's the best feeling in the world. And I just would love to be that kind of writer. I just want to be the kind of writer that does that and delivers you a story that you can pick up from the bookshop and take it home and just be happy that you have those few hours to disappear into a story. So honestly, that would be what I would love people to take from the story, that they had that time away. And in terms of like the questions that I examine, I mean, they're things that fascinate me and interest me. I hope they fascinate and interest people too. And I hope it does make people think a little bit.
Well, you certainly have crafted in this book and also in the Cormac Reilly series, all of which I have read, a book that you can escape into and be in that world. So congratulations on that.
Thank you. Thank you. You're so kind. Thank you so much.
Dervla, is there something that you know now that you wish you had before being published?
Oh, so many things. Is there something I know now that I wish I had known beforehand? Oh, it's going to sound really cheesy. It really is. It's going to sound like a line, but it's not a line. It's the absolute truth. Like, I don't want to downplay how exciting it is to be published, because it's bloody exciting. And lots of crazy, amazing things happen along the road that you're pinching yourself. You can't believe that happened. But the honest truth is, the very, very best part of writing is the writing. It is. It's still the best part of writing. Like, not every moment, obviously, but when it starts to take off under your hands, and when the characters start to become real, and the story starts to feel like something you're reading instead of writing, it's just the best. It's uncompromised. It's clean. It's clear. It's just the best thing. And I wish I'd known it, because, well, I don't know, maybe some part of me knew it. I remember I went to a writers' festival at Margaret River before I was published, and my husband came down to meet me after the first day. And I was so happy, because I met Sarah Foster, who was a published writer at the time and became one of my very best friends. And we hit it off really well. So I had a new friend. I was hanging out with book people. I was writing myself at that stage. And I remember distinctly saying to Kenny as we crossed the road in Margaret River, I don't care if I am never published. If I get to do this, I get to write in the evenings, and I get to come away like this sometimes and be with book people. Like, it's everything. And it is really true. So for people who are out there trying to get published, I'm not saying give up by any means. Like, I'm not saying that, but I'm just saying that you already have the best bit. And no one can give that to you, and no one can take it away. That is yours forever.
It's all about the journey, isn't it? It's all about, the people that you meet and the connections that you make along the way.
It is. And books, that's what books is about. Like, I was out today, we went to Dimmock's Neutral Bay, which is this gorgeous bookshop, and we met amazing booksellers, and just having that chat. And it's like, they're your tribe, like they're your tribe, because they're your people. We're all readers, and we love story. And that's the whole thread that brings us together, and people talking about the books they love and sharing stories because they're like, they love them just for no other reason than that. There's something special about it. There really is.
I think I mentioned earlier on in my introduction your Audible original novellas. I've listened to 2 out of the 3 of these.
Have you really?
Yeah, and I absolutely loved them. So I wanted to ask you, how did that opportunity come about? And do you plan on creating any full-length stories out of any of those in the future? Now, I know one was a prequel for a Cormac Reilly book, but of the other 2?
Well, how it happened was The Ruin was very successful in the US on Audible particularly, which I think is in large part due to my narrator. Aoife McMahon narrates my novels, and she's bloody brilliant. She just knows how to tell a great story. So Aoife read the book, and then Audible chose it just for no reason, like, because it was really almost slush pile stuff. Like, I was published by Penguin in the US, but it was not in a huge way, it didn't have a massive campaign behind it, though they obviously gave it plenty of support. But Audible just kind of plucked it and made it, I think, an editor's choice for a month or something, which really brought the book into people's vision, and it was really embraced. And so the books have always done really well on Audible in the US. And then Audible just came and said, would Dervla be interested in writing an audio exclusive, a novella for us? I thought, that sounds like fun, it's something different. And I love audiobooks anyway. I listen to a lot of them, kind of I'm half and half really. And so I kind of loved the idea of doing that. So I gave it a go, and it went really well. And then they asked me if I was interested in signing up for a few more. So I've really enjoyed writing them. They're fun and they're different. Whether I'll write a full novel from any of them, I'm not planning on it. I mean, The Sisters is probably the closest, because I do have a story for Carrie and her sister. Carrie's a cop and Aoife is a barrister. And I had a plan for them, and I still think I may come back for it, because I really like where that story could go. So, but it would be set quite a distance forward from The Sisters when Carrie's older. So possibly that one, but not any of the others, I don't think.
Yeah. No, I really enjoyed The Sisters. I'd love to hear more from them.
Oh, great. Thank you. That's lovely to hear.
Now, I understand The Ruin has been optioned for a screen adaptation. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, was very exciting when it happened, and I'm thrilled that it seems to be happening, though it's gone a little slow now with COVID. I think the last I heard was towards the end of last year, some stuff was going on, but it seems to have gone a little quiet again. However, I'm not very closely connected to that production, so they could be filming tomorrow. I know if they're filming tomorrow, I would know, but I don't know the ins and outs of what's going on The Ruin, really. However, I can say, and I'm super excited about it, the Murder Rule has been optioned by FX, which is a really big cable company in the US. They go into 90 million homes, which is pretty much everybody who has cable in the US gets FX. And they make really high-end drama like The Americans and Nip Tuck and stuff like that. And so they've optioned it, which is really exciting. But even more exciting, they're already writers working on it. And I'm told it's going into production this year. So
oh my goodness,
a limited series. So that's really, really exciing. I'm so happy.
That is exciting. Congratulations. That is brilliant news. And I didn't see that anywhere. So
yeah.
So that was a lovely surprise.
It's pretty new.
How wonderful. Okay, so I don't want to take away from this wonderful novel, which I absolutely loved, but what about Reilly? What about Cormac? Are we going to see any more from him ever?
I don't know. I really don't know. I feel like I'll go back to that world at some point. I feel like I will. Like, I feel like there are more stories there to tell. I'm just not ready yet. And it's kind of interesting because I'll be honest, Lorraine, you're not the first person to ask me that particular question on this tour. And it's forced me to really think, what story would I write with him in it? If I had to write one now, where would I go? And suddenly my brain is working on it. I'm beginning to get ideas and thoughts, and I'm like, no, I haven't got time. I've got another story to write first. I love Cormac Reilly. I care about him. That sounds stupid because he's made up, but I do. And I feel like I'm just not ready to go back to his world yet. I feel like to go back, I would need him to move forward in time. Other things would have had to have happened in his life. He would have had to change. And I think I need to be a little bit older to go back and write him at a different stage, because I don't ever want to write kind of episodic fiction where you have the same character in a different set of circumstances each book. I want the character to change and grow and be forced to change and grow by the circumstances of the book. So for Cormac, who'd been through so much for 3 books, I think he needs a break. I think he needs some time for his life to move forward before I can come back. So I do hope to come back, but just not yet.
Oh, okay. Well, it's a watch this space then.
Watch this space, yeah.
Fantastic. And Dervla, you might know that there are a lot of aspiring authors and writers who listen to this podcast. And given all of your experiences to date, I wondered if you had any tips to offer for those people looking to get published or wanting to write.
Well, I can tell you a couple of things that I think made a difference for me, if that's any use to anybody. I mean, the first thing was I was working and I had small children, so time was very tight. I only could squeeze a couple of hours out of the day at the very end of the day. And everybody was talking about social media and how important it is to have a profile when you're trying to get literary representation. So I was not on social media at all at the time. And I was like, should I be going and learning how to do this? Should I be going to writers groups? Should I be building my network, which was part of the advice? And I just figured, look, I've only got time for one thing. And I think that thing had probably better be the writing. So I'm just going to focus on trying to be the best writer I can be and leave all the rest of it and worry about it later. And that was definitely the right decision for me. And I still try to put writing before everything else, and always will, I hope. The other thing is a very practical piece of advice, which is that if you are looking for an agent, I think people should be aware that you don't have to only contact Australian agents. There are very few literary agents in Australia. And the reality is, when we first start querying our work, sometimes we don't do it very well. You're new, you're learning how to write a query letter, you're learning how to pitch yourself, and maybe you screw it up. You don't want to burn through every literary agent in Australia and then realize that you had a typo in your last sentence. It's just a bit too quick. So what I would say is, look, there are lots of agents in the US and the UK who are interested in representing you if you've got a good story. It's all about the story. Most of them can be queried through email. Most of them are very clear on their websites what they want. When I was querying, there was a service called Query Tracker. I think it was like you paid a subscription and is it still around?
Still around, yeah.
Yeah. So you can choose the genre you're writing in, and you'll find the agents who are looking for your kind of work. So you're not wasting your time querying people who only rep nonfiction, for example, if you write women's fiction. So you can find the people who are interested in your work and query that way. Your query letter is insanely important, and it has to be very short. And if you're out there and you're a young writer, please don't start, a new writer, please don't start by saying how rubbish you are. You're there to tell your story, and not to, you might feel embarrassed and awkward and uncomfortable, but that's okay. That's private for you. In this letter, you're just selling your story. There is a woman called Janet Reed, who's an agent in the US, and for years she wrote a blog called Query Shark. Have you come across that, Claude?
Yes, I have. Yeah.
So in Query Shark, in the early days, it was anonymous, and she used to just rip query letters to shreds. And then it became not anonymous. So you could send in your query letter, and she will tell you where you've gone wrong. And my God, she does not hold back. But there's a whole set of like 400 or something query letters that she's been through, and you can read all that. It's available online for free. And if you do that and practice, you'll write an awesome query letter. I learned how to do it from her stuff. I wrote it while I was writing the book. Like, so I would come back to it every few weeks and try and make it better, because it's very hard to write your story in 200 words. And if you do those things, I think you'll set yourself up relatively well to give yourself every chance.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah, I'd quite forgotten about Query Shark. I'd heard about that some years ago now. So that's so interesting to hear it again.
Yeah, it's I haven't looked at it for a long time, but I used to so love reading it. And it was like almost like a reward when I'd finished writing at the end of the night. You'd have a look at what was on Query Shark. And it's just like when you don't know anybody in the industry, you don't know anybody in publishing, you don't know anybody who's ever come close to being published. You're so much on the outside. And I think getting that little window in is just hugely helpful.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much. Dervla, I wanted to say that The Murder Rule was a brilliant read that I thoroughly recommend to all crime fiction lovers out there. I wish you every success with it and the others that will no doubt follow. And I can't wait to see what you do next. Thank you for joining me on Talking Aussie Books today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Claudine. It's been an absolute pleasure.
That's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast episode, please drop me a line via my webpage at claudinetinellis.com, via Instagram, Facebook or Twitter. Alternatively, consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or Google Podcasts. Until next time, happy reading.